The camera opens on a winter courtyard in Warsaw, January 1942, snow pressed flat by boots that do not pause, while a single woman in a gray habit stands beside a wooden table, her breath visible, her hands steady around a clipboard that should not exist. Imagine it, if a list of names can decide who lives and who disappears forever. What would you write down when every word could be a death sentence? Behind the convent walls of the Sisters of the Family of Mary. Just 3 streets from the Warsaw Ghetto, a nun waits as children are ushered past her one by one, their shoes too thin, their eyes already old. The list she holds claims they are Catholic orphans, transferred from bombed villages, birthdates neatly aligned parishes, carefully invented, parents conveniently deceased. In 1942 alone, more than 300,000 Jews would be deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka, most within months, a statistic that hums beneath every pen stroke. Somewhere nearby, a German truck idles diesel fumes mixing with incense, drifting from the chapel door. A chipped enamel coffee cup sits forgotten on the table, cooling fast. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And before we go further, tell us in the comments, what time is it, where you are right now, and what country are you watching from? By March 1942, paper had become one of the most dangerous materials in occupied Poland. Inside a requisitioned municipal office on Daniłowiczowska Street, its windows permanently filmed with grime, German clerks processed thousands of forms each week. Residency permits, labor allocations, ration cards, each stamped, signed, and filed with mechanical obedience. The nun understood this machinery better than most civilians. She had watched it grind people down, not with bullets, but with forms, seals, and carbon copies. And so she chose to fight it using its own language. Her fake orphan lists were not simple fabrications. Each name was anchored to a plausible village, one that had been bombed in September 1939 when Luftwaffe raids destroyed more than 10,000 buildings across Poland in a single month. Each child was assigned a date of birth that fit neatly into the gaps of parish ledgers already half burned or missing. She studied which counties had lost priests, which records had been temporarily misplaced during evacuations, and which civil servants were overworked enough not to ask questions. One rumor, whispered later among resistance couriers, claimed she memorized entire parish maps the way others memorized prayers. The process was logistical, almost industrial. First came the handwritten draft, done at night by candlelight, in a convent corridor that smelled of soap and boiled cabbage. Then the typed version hammered out on a borrowed German typewriter whose keys stuck on certain letters, forcing her to adjust spelling to hide the machine's flaws. Finally, the stamp acquired through a sympathetic Polish clerk who kept it wrapped in cloth inside a desk drawer, using it only when the hallway was empty. In 1942, possession of forged documents could mean immediate execution. The German authorities had already shot thousands for far less organized resistance. There were moments of speed and panic. A knock at the door during typing, boots echoing too long in the stairwell, a nun dropping a page and watching ink smear across a name that represented a real child somewhere holding their breath. And then there were the slow moments waiting for ink to dry, listening to distant trains leaving the Umschlagplatz, each transport carrying roughly 5,000 people toward Treblinka, a number so precise it felt unreal. An everyday detail survives in one later testimony, a torn corner on a ration card chewed absent-mindedly by a child while waiting to be renamed. The nun noticed it and quietly replaced the card, knowing that even a small irregularity could attract attention during inspections. By the end of the summer of 1942, the lists had grown longer, their falsehoods more intricate, their survival rate dependent not on courage alone, but on flawless bureaucracy performed under terror. By late 1942, the children themselves had become part of the system of deception, though none of them would have chosen it. Inside the convent dormitory on Żelazna Street, the days followed a strict rhythm designed not for prayer, but for survival. Bells rang at fixed hours, meals were eaten in silence, and names were spoken only when absolutely necessary. Each child had learned a new identity, one that had to feel natural enough to answer to in a heartbeat. Hesitation could be fatal. The nun understood that forged papers alone were not enough. German inspections were unpredictable and often theatrical, designed to provoke fear and mistakes. During one inspection in November 1942, an SS officer reportedly asked a 7-year-old girl to recite the Lord's Prayer. The child froze her mouth, opening without sound. The nun stepped forward instantly, scolding the girl for feigning illness and ushering her away before suspicion could take root. Later that same night, she sat with the child on the edge of a narrow iron bed and taught her the prayer, syllable by syllable, not as faith, but as camouflage. Statistics hovered in the background like an approaching storm. By the end of 1942, approximately 1.7 million Jews had already been murdered in Operation Reinhard, a scale of killing so vast that individual lives seemed to vanish into abstraction. And yet, here in a single room, survival depended on intimate, everyday details. How to cross oneself convincingly, how to pronounce a Polish surname without a Yiddish cadence, how to eat soup slowly enough not to appear starved. A chipped bowl repaired with wire passed from hand to hand, each child careful not to spill. The emotional cost was cumulative. Children were instructed never to ask about their parents. Photographs were confiscated and hidden in a locked drawer in the convent office alongside a small notebook where the nun recorded real names in cramped handwriting, a ledger of truth buried beneath layers of lies. Some nights, children cried softly into pillows stiff with starch, learning that grief itself had to be rationed. One boy reportedly whispered his real name into the mattress each night, afraid that if he stopped saying it, it would disappear forever. The transformation was visible. Children who arrived flinching at every sound slowly learned the patterns of safety, which footsteps belonged to nuns, which voices signaled danger when to lower their eyes, before fear had been loud and chaotic. After months inside the convent, it became disciplined, almost invisible. This was the cost of survival, a psychological reshaping as profound as any physical hunger. A small human moment survives in later recollections, a child arguing quietly with another over a missing wooden spoon, both desperate for normalcy in a world that demanded erasure. The nun resolved the argument not with authority, but by carving a second spoon from scrap wood late at night under a single lamp. By December 1942, the children had learned the hardest lesson of all. Silence could be louder than screams, and forgetting at least temporarily was sometimes the only way to live. February 1943 arrived with thawing snow and tightening control. In occupied Warsaw, German authorities intensified inspections after discovering multiple forged labor papers in the Praga district, and rumors spread quickly through convent corridors that the next sweep would include religious institutions. The nun knew what this meant. One error, one mismatched birth date, one parish that no longer existed on a German map could collapse everything she had built. The lists were no longer just tools of rescue. They were liabilities that could condemn dozens in a single afternoon. The danger crystallized around a detail so small it almost escaped noticing. German administrative offices used a standardized blue-black ink introduced in late 1942 to prevent document tampering. One of the convent's forged lists, prepared in January, carried an older shade slightly browner when held to the light. It was the kind of discrepancy only a bored clerk or a suspicious officer would notice, but in 1943, suspicion was policy. Across Poland, more than 2,000 members of the clergy would be arrested or killed during the occupation, many for acts of quiet defiance that never reached official reports. The response had to be immediate. Over 3 nights, the nun rewrote the entire list, 43 names, matching ink density pressure and spacing to the newer standard. Her fingers cramped, her eyes burned, and the convent's only clock ticked loudly enough to feel accusatory. An everyday object took on unbearable importance. A ruler used to keep margins perfectly aligned, wiped clean after every page, so no graphite trace remained. Outside trains continued to move east. In the first months of 1943, deportations resumed after the January pause, each transport carrying thousands toward camps that were no longer rumors, but destinations with schedules. The risk was not only technical, trust itself became fragile. A visiting diocesan official, loyal but cautious, warned her that collaboration accusations were being used to justify arrests. Even those who helped could panic under pressure. She began splitting information deliberately. No single person knew every child's real name, every false origin, every hiding place. The notebook of true identities was removed from the office drawer and hidden inside a hollow space behind a chapel wall wrapped in oilcloth alongside a rosary with missing beads. A fast, terrifying moment cut through the careful planning on March 18, 1943. German officers arrived unannounced, boots echoing through stone hallways, demanding records for all minors housed on the premises. The nun handed over the newly corrected list without comment. An officer paused, tracing a finger down the page, stopping once, then again. The room seemed to contract around the sound of paper shifting. A child coughed. Somewhere in the building, water dripped steadily from a faulty pipe. After several seconds, long enough to feel like a verdict, the officer snapped the folder shut and returned it. No explanation, no warning, just departure. The nun did not move until the engines outside faded. That evening, dinner was served in complete silence, not by rule, but by instinct. No prayers were spoken aloud. The danger had passed for the moment, but everyone understood the truth. Survival now depended on perfection, and perfection could not last forever. By the summer of 1943, faith itself had become unstable ground. Deportations accelerated again after the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto in April, and the streets around the convent filled with the displaced residue of a city half erased. Smoke still lingered in the air weeks later, carrying the smell of burned paper and brick, a reminder of how easily records and people could vanish. The nun walked past German notices posted on walls, each decree written in precise language that reduced entire lives to violations and penalties. She read them carefully, not out of obedience, but to measure how much room remained to lie. Internally, the conflict sharpened. Every child saved required deliberate deception. False baptisms entered into parish books, invented godparents fabricated histories of Catholic suffering that mirrored Jewish tragedy, but erased its cause. She had been taught that lying was a sin, yet here truth delivered death with administrative efficiency. One night, after completing a new batch of Orphan transfers, dated August 1943, she sat alone in the chapel long after candles burned down, staring at the altar without praying. A rumor later circulated among surviving children that she whispered apologies to God to the parents who would never reclaim their sons and daughters, to the children themselves, for the identities she had stolen and replaced. Statistics pressed in again, cold and unyielding. By mid-1943, an estimated 90% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population, around 3 million people, had already been murdered. Against numbers like these, the convent's handful of rescued children felt impossibly small, almost insignificant. And yet each new list represented a logistical miracle transport, arranged through Catholic Charities' ration allocations, recalculated inspection schedules tracked and avoided. One slow afternoon detail survives the nun stirring soup in a dented pot while mentally rehearsing cover stories, the steam fogging her glasses, as if the world itself were blurring moral lines. The psychological transformation was unmistakable. Before the war, her obedience had been vertical toward God-church rule. Now it was horizontal toward living bodies in front of her. She no longer asked whether an action was permitted, only whether it would keep a child alive another day. This shift carried its own quiet terror. What remains of faith when it must be bent daily to oppose law, authority, and even doctrine? Here, the story turns outward to you. If you were in her place, would you call these lies a betrayal of belief or its purest expression? And when survival depends on erasing a child's past to secure their future, where does responsibility truly end? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because these questions do not belong only to history. That autumn, as leaves fell into the convent courtyard and inspections grew harsher, the nun added fewer names to her lists. Not because the need had vanished, but because the margins for error had narrowed to nothing. Each new rescue now felt like borrowing time from a future that might never arrive. January 1945 did not arrive with celebration. When the Red Army entered the ruins of Warsaw on January 17th, the city was a skeleton, over 85% of its buildings destroyed, streets erased into gray corridors of rubble. The convent still stood damaged but upright, its walls blackened by smoke, its windows patched with mismatched panes. For the children inside, liberation was not a moment of joy, but of confusion. The uniforms had changed, the shouting language had shifted, yet fear remained trained deep into muscle and memory. The nun faced a problem she had never prepared for truth. The fake orphan lists, once shields against death, now became fragile bridges back to stolen identities. Many parents were gone killed in Treblinka, Majdanek, Auschwitz, names that now surfaced openly no longer whispered. In 1945, fewer than 300,000 Jews remained alive in Poland from a pre-war population of over 3 million. The arithmetic of survival was brutal, and it meant that for many children, there would be no one to come looking. She brought the hidden notebook out from the chapel wall at night. Its pages smelled of dust and candle smoke, the ink slightly faded but legible. One by one, she began the slow process of matching real names to false ones, tracing lines across years of deception. Some children listened in silence. Others argued, insisting the convent name was their real one, now that the past felt like a story belonging to someone else. A boy refused to answer to the name written beside his birth date, pushing the paper away as if it might burn him. An everyday detail marks this moment, a child clutching a cracked enamel mug. During these conversations, knuckles white, afraid that accepting the truth might cost the only safety they had known. Liberation demanded a different kind of courage, one not measured by silence, but by memory. The nun herself changed. The precision that once defined her work, perfect margins, flawless dates, gave way to uncertainty. There were no procedures for returning identities, no manuals for unlearning survival. She wrote letters to Jewish aid organizations, newly reforming, amid the chaos, copying names by hand, because typewriters were scarce, electricity unreliable. Trains ran again, but erratically carrying refugees instead of deportees, their destinations hopeful but unclear. And before this section ends, consider this yourself. If your childhood had been built on a lie that saved your life, would you want that lie taken away once the danger passed? And who should decide when the truth returns? The rescuer, the survivor, or history itself? Share your thoughts below, because the end of war is not the end of its moral weight. By the spring of 1945, some children left the convent with new guardians. Others stayed on, unable or unwilling to step into a world that had already proven it could erase them. The fake lists were no longer tools of resistance. They had become artifacts fragile, necessary, and unbearably human. In the late 1970s, long after uniforms had faded into museum glass and Warsaw had rebuilt itself in concrete and memory, a carpenter repairing the convent attic found a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a narrow space, dust-thick and untouched for decades, and inside that space, a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Its edges darkened, its pages brittle. The names inside were written in 2 columns, one false, one real, each line a quiet act of defiance that had survived fire, occupation, and forgetting. The nun who wrote them had died years earlier. Her work largely unrecorded, her choices never explained in her own voice. When historians later examined the notebook, they counted just over 250 names. It was not a large number by the arithmetic of war. 6 million Jews murdered across Europe, 3 million of them Polish. Against that scale, a few hundred lives could seem almost symbolic. But symbols matter. Each name represented a logistical chain that had not broken forged papers, accepted inspections, survived trains, avoided children, fed, taught, renamed, and kept alive long enough to outgrow fear. One page still bore a faint ring where a cup had once rested, staining the paper in a perfect circle, a domestic mark on a record of survival. Some of the children named in the ledger were found decades later. They remembered fragments, the smell of soap, the sound of bells, the way silence was enforced, not with punishment, but with urgency. A few returned to the convent as adults standing in the courtyard where their lives had once been reduced to ink and dates. No plaque listed their names. No statue marked the spot. The absence felt deliberate, almost appropriate. The final image lingers on the ledger itself, now preserved in an archive. Its pages turn slowly by gloved hands. Ink fades, paper yellows. But the deception it contains remains legible, a reminder that resistance does not always announce itself with explosions or speeches. Sometimes it survives as handwriting in the margins of history, waiting for someone patient enough to look under the floorboards. The attic is quiet again. The board has been replaced. The convent resumes its ordinary rhythm. And the names, once fake, once forbidden, remain suspended between what they hid and what they saved. History often trains us to listen for noise. The roar of armies, the crack of gunfire, the shouting of men who believe power must be loud to be real. But the story that remains here moves in the opposite direction, slowing as it ends, asking us to notice the quieter forces that shape survival. A nun with a pen. A list that lied so that children could live. A ledger hidden not to deceive forever, but to delay truth until it was safe to remember. What lingers is not heroism in the traditional sense, but endurance, moral, psychological, and painfully human. The children were transformed not only by what they escaped, but by what they became: experts in silence, apprentices of fear, survivors shaped by names that were never theirs. The nun, too, crossed a boundary she could never fully explain. learning that goodness sometimes requires contamination, that purity can be lethal in a world governed by murderous precision. Years later, when the ledger surfaced, it did not resolve anything neatly. It did not reunite all families or heal the fractures carved into childhoods. Instead, it offered something more fragile and more honest proof that, in a system designed to erase identity, someone chose to manufacture it instead carefully night after night, at great personal risk. Memory works the same way. It is incomplete. It smudges at the edges. It survives accidents and neglect. And yet, like that ledger in the attic, it waits, waiting for us to open it gently, waiting for us to accept that history is not only what was destroyed, but what was quietly preserved by those who understood that saving a single life could still mean defying an entire world.